land that refused to forget. Imagine standing alone in the Egyptian desert at midnight. There is no city, no traffic, no voices, only the sound of the wind moving across the sand. Above you, the stars seem impossibly close, and in the distance, rising from the darkness, are monuments built by people who disappeared thousands of years ago. The pyramids, the temples, the tombs, they have survived kings. They have survived wars. They have survived earthquakes, thieves, empires, and the passing of entire civilizations. But they were never simply monuments. They were built for something far more important: eternity. Ancient Egyptians believed that death was not the end of existence. It was a passage, a journey into another world. And for that journey, the dead needed protection. They needed food. They needed possessions. They needed prayers. They needed magical words. And most importantly, they needed their bodies. Because in ancient Egypt, destroying the body could mean threatening the existence of the person forever. This belief created one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history. A civilization that spent thousands of years preparing for death. They built enormous tombs. They preserved human bodies. They created mysterious rituals. They wrote spells on walls. They buried treasures beneath the earth. They constructed entire cities for the dead. And sometimes they tried to erase the dead completely. Names were removed from monuments. Faces were destroyed. Statues were smashed. Kings vanished from official history. Queens disappeared without known tombs. And some mummies still carry secrets that modern science has not completely solved. There were also murders, political conspiracies, tomb robberies, strange deaths, forgotten rulers, and stories of curses that would later terrify the modern world. But how much of the darkness surrounding ancient Egypt is real? How much was created by ancient belief? And how much was invented thousands of years later? Tonight, we are going beneath the surface, not into the Egypt of postcards and golden treasures, but into the Egypt of darkness, the Egypt of tombs, the Egypt of forgotten names, the Egypt of death. This is the story of Dark Egypt, Mysteries Beneath the Sands. Chapter 1. The Kingdom That Feared Death. Long before tourists stood beneath the pyramids, before archaeologists opened sealed tombs, before museums filled their galleries with golden masks, the people of the Nile were already asking one of humanity's oldest questions. What happens after we die? For the ancient Egyptians, the answer was not simple. Death did not mean that a person simply disappeared. Instead, death was the beginning of a dangerous journey. A journey into another realm. A journey that required preparation. And perhaps nowhere in the ancient world was this preparation taken more seriously. The Egyptian civilization developed around the Nile. Every year, the river flooded the surrounding land. The flood brought fertile soil. Fields became green. Crops grew. Life returned. Then the waters receded. The cycle began again. Life, death, rebirth. For the Egyptians, this natural cycle was not simply an agricultural reality. It became a powerful symbol of existence itself. The sun disappeared every evening, then returned every morning. Plants died, then returned with the seasons. the Nile flooded, then withdrew. And so the Egyptians imagined that human beings could also pass through death and return to another form of existence. But there was a problem. The journey after death was dangerous. The dead could not simply walk into eternity. They needed preparation, they needed protection, and they needed a body. This belief helps explain one of the most famous practices of ancient Egypt, mummification. To the modern eye, mummification can seem horrifying. A dead body is opened, internal organs are removed, the body is dried. It is wrapped in layers of linen. Amulets are placed among the bandages. The face is carefully preserved. The entire process can take weeks, but to the ancient Egyptians, this was not an act of horror. It was an act of preservation. The body was being prepared for eternity. The Egyptians believed that different aspects of a person continued to exist after death. One of these was the ka. The ka could be understood as a vital life force. Another was the ba, often represented in art as a human-headed bird. The ba was connected with movement and personality. There was also the akh, associated with the transformed spirit of the deceased. These concepts were complicated. They changed across different periods of Egyptian history, but together they reveal something important. The Egyptians did not think of death as simple disappearance. A person could continue, but continuing required preparation, and the body was central to that preparation. This is why tombs became so important. A tomb was not merely a place to bury someone. It could become a house for eternity. Inside might be food, furniture, clothing, jewelry, weapons, cosmetics, statues, images, and sometimes enormous quantities of objects. Everything had a purpose. The dead might need these things in the next world. But there was another reason. The dead person's name needed to survive. A name was more than an identification. It was connected to existence. If a person's name continued to be spoken, remembered, and written, that person could continue to exist in some sense. And this is where the story of ancient Egypt begins to become darker. Because if remembering someone could help preserve them, then forgetting someone could become a weapon. Destroying a person's name could become an attempt to destroy their memory. And destroying their image could become an attempt to attack their existence. Thousands of years later, we would discover evidence of this practice carved into stone. Names deliberately erased, faces damaged, statues destroyed. The enemies of ancient Egypt understood something that modern historians would only fully appreciate much later. Memory was power. But before we reach the forgotten kings, we need to understand the world they feared. The Egyptian afterlife was not simply a peaceful paradise. It could be terrifying. The dead were expected to travel through the Duat. The Duat was the mysterious realm of the dead. It was filled with obstacles. There were gates, guardians, dangerous creatures, supernatural beings, and forces of chaos. The deceased needed knowledge to survive. They needed to know the names of beings they would encounter. They needed to know the correct words. They needed to know how to navigate the darkness. This is one reason funerary texts became so important. The earliest examples include the pyramid texts. Later came the coffin texts, and eventually collections that modern scholars call the Book of the Dead. The name can be misleading. It was not one single book. There was no single official version. Instead, it was a collection of spells and instructions that could be selected and adapted for individuals. Some were written on papyrus, others appeared on coffins, some appeared directly on tomb walls. They were designed to help the deceased survive the afterlife. Imagine the scene. A person dies, their body is prepared, their tomb is sealed, and somewhere inside, written in darkness, are words intended to guide them through the next world. Words that were believed to have power. Words that could protect. Words that could open doors. Words that could defeat enemies. Words that could allow the dead to speak before the gods. But even knowing the spells was not enough. The dead would eventually face judgment. At the center of this judgment was the heart. The Egyptians believed the heart was connected to thought, character, memory, and morality. Unlike many other organs, the heart was generally left inside the body during mummification. It was too important to remove, because one day the heart would be tested. The scene became one of the most powerful images in Egyptian religion. The deceased stands before Osiris, Lord of the dead. Nearby is Anubis, the jackal-headed god, associated with embalming and funerary rites. Anubis oversees the scales. On one side is the heart of the deceased, on the other, the feather of Ma'at. Ma'at represented truth, balance, order, and cosmic justice. The heart must not be too heavy. If the person's life had been corrupted by wrongdoing, the heart could fail the test. And waiting nearby was one of the most frightening creatures in Egyptian mythology. Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Ammit was known as the devourer. If the deceased failed judgment, Ammit could consume the heart. The person would be denied the peaceful afterlife they had hoped to achieve. For the Egyptians, this was not simply a monster story. It was a warning. Your life mattered. Your actions mattered. Your character mattered. Death would not erase what you had done. And this belief explains another strange feature of Egyptian tombs. The dead were surrounded by images. Images of food. Images of servants. Images of fields. Images of boats. Images of animals. Images of daily life. Why? Because the image itself could have a function. A painted offering could symbolically provide food. A statue could serve as a substitute body. A carved servant could perform work for the deceased. The tomb became a carefully constructed machine for eternity. Every detail mattered. Every object had meaning. Every word could have power. And every threat had to be anticipated. But there was one threat that no spell could completely eliminate: human beings, tomb robbers. The greatest danger to an Egyptian burial was not always a supernatural monster. Sometimes it was another person. Imagine a royal tomb shortly after a pharaoh's funeral. The ceremonies are finished. The priests have left. The entrance is sealed. Guards may have been posted. Inside the darkness are treasures accumulated over an entire lifetime. Gold, jewelry, furniture, weapons, precious stones, sacred objects, and at the center, the body of a king. To the Egyptians, these objects were sacred. To thieves, they were wealth. Tomb robbery became a persistent problem throughout Egyptian history. Some tombs were robbed soon after burial. Others were disturbed centuries later. Ancient officials investigated thefts. People were questioned. Suspects were arrested. Confessions were recorded. The surviving documents give us something extraordinary. They allow us to see ancient Egypt not only through the eyes of kings, but through the eyes of criminals. Men who entered tombs at night. Men who broke through walls. Men who stole gold from the dead. Men who knew exactly where treasures were hidden. And sometimes the authorities discovered that the people responsible for protecting the tombs were involved themselves. The kingdom of the dead was not always peaceful. It could be a battlefield between memory and forgetting, between preservation and destruction, between those who wanted eternity and those who wanted treasure. And this tension would eventually shape the history of Egyptian archaeology. Because, ironically, some of the greatest discoveries survived precisely because their tombs were forgotten. A forgotten tomb could become a time capsule. Its entrance could disappear beneath sand. Its location could vanish from memory. Its treasures could remain untouched. Its walls could remain sealed. And thousands of years later, someone might find it. That is what makes Egypt so haunting. The ancient Egyptians wanted to defeat time. They built monuments designed to last forever. They preserved bodies. They wrote names into stone. They filled tombs with messages. And somehow their strategy worked. We are still here, still looking, still reading their names, still trying to understand their fears. But the deeper we go into ancient Egypt, the more complicated the mystery becomes. Because some people did not want to be remembered. Some kings were deliberately erased. Some queens vanished. Some bodies disappeared. Some tombs remain unknown. And some ancient crimes may still be hiding inside the evidence. The desert has kept its secrets for thousands of years. And tonight, we have only just begun to uncover them. Because beneath the monuments, beneath the temples, beneath the sand, lies a darker Egypt. An Egypt where death was not the end. It was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Night Journey of the Dead. Night falls over the Nile. The temples become silent. The fires inside the sanctuaries begin to disappear, one by one. Above the rooftops, the stars emerge, and somewhere inside a darkened tomb, a dead man waits. His body has been prepared. His eyes are closed. His hands rest against his chest. Around him are offerings, amulets, images of gods, and words written by priests. The living have done everything they can, but now the dead must travel alone. According to ancient Egyptian belief, death was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. A journey through a mysterious realm known as the Duat. To modern ears, the word underworld can sound like a simple place, a kingdom beneath the earth, a dark world inhabited by the dead. But the Egyptian Duat was far more complicated. It was not simply underground. It was a supernatural realm, connected to the movement of the sun, the gods, the dead, and the forces of chaos. Every night, the sun itself appeared to disappear. From the perspective of those living along the Nile, Ra, the sun god, crossed the sky during the day. Then, at sunset, he descended into darkness. The Egyptians believed This was not merely the sun disappearing beyond the horizon. Ra was beginning a journey through the Duat. And during those hours of darkness, the sun god would encounter dangers, enemies, serpents, gates, guardians, and the great force of chaos itself. The most important of these enemies was a gigantic serpent known as Apophis, or Apep, a creature of darkness and disorder, a force that opposed the order of the universe. Every night, Ra had to survive, and every morning, the sun returned. For the Egyptians, this cycle was proof of something extraordinary. The universe itself had to be renewed every night. Light had to defeat darkness. Order had to defeat chaos. Life had to defeat death. And human beings were part of that cosmic struggle. The dead were not simply going to sleep. They were entering a dangerous world where they needed knowledge and protection. This explains why Egyptian tombs became filled with magical texts. The walls could contain maps of the underworld, lists of names, descriptions of gates, images of gods, instructions, spells, warnings. The dead needed to know what they would encounter, because in the Egyptian imagination, knowledge could be a weapon. Imagine entering the Duat. There is no familiar landscape, no sunlight, no ordinary road, only darkness. Ahead stands a gate. Beside it is a guardian. The guardian has a name, and the dead must know it. The deceased approaches. A question is asked. A name must be spoken. If the answer is correct, the journey continues. If it is wrong, the path may be blocked. This idea appears repeatedly in Egyptian funerary literature. The afterlife is a place where names matter. Names identify power. Names reveal identity. Knowing the name of a supernatural being could give the deceased some protection against it. The ancient Egyptians believed that words had power. A name written correctly was not merely information. It could help make something present. A spell was not simply a sentence. It was an action. This is why Egyptian funerary texts can sometimes feel less like stories and more like instructions. They tell the deceased what to say, where to go, what to avoid, who to recognize, and what to do. The goal was survival. The Duat was filled with strange landscapes. Some texts describe fields, others describe rivers. There are fiery regions, dangerous lakes, mysterious gates, mountains, islands, serpents, and supernatural beings. The geography was not always consistent. Different periods produced different descriptions. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife changed over thousands of years, but the central idea remained. The dead had to pass through danger before reaching eternal existence. And perhaps the most frightening danger was not a monster. It was failure. Failure to know the correct spell. Failure to pass judgment. Failure to preserve the body. Failure to maintain the person's name. Failure to satisfy the gods. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with avoiding failure in death, because death was permanent if the proper order was not maintained. This is where the Egyptian concept of Ma'at becomes important. Ma'at represented truth, justice, balance, order, harmony. The Egyptians believed that The universe itself depended upon Ma'at. The Nile had to rise. The sun had to travel. The seasons had to follow their patterns. Kings had to maintain order. People had to behave correctly. And after death, the individual would face judgment. The journey through the Duat eventually led toward one of the most famous scenes in Egyptian religion, the judgment of the heart. Picture the chamber. The deceased stands before the gods. Anubis is nearby. The scales are prepared. The heart is placed on one side. The feather of Ma'at is placed on the other. For the ancient Egyptians, the heart was more than an organ. It was deeply connected with a person's identity, their thoughts, their emotions, their character, their memories. The Egyptians generally left the heart inside the body during mummification. Other organs were removed and preserved, but the heart was different. It had a role to play. One day, it would speak for the person. The deceased would face a series of declarations. In many versions of the funerary texts, the individual denies having committed various wrongs. They declare that they have not stolen, they have not lied, they have not murdered, they have not cheated, they have not caused suffering. These statements became known in modern scholarship as the negative confession. The deceased was essentially presenting a defense, a final testimony, a final argument. The person was saying, I lived correctly. I maintained Ma'at. I deserve to continue. But the ultimate decision belonged to the gods. Anubis oversees the scales. Thoth, the ibis-headed god associated with writing and knowledge, records the result. Osiris, lord of the dead, presides over the judgment, and nearby waits Ammit, the devourer. She is one of the most frightening creatures in Egyptian mythology. Her body combines some of the most dangerous animals known to the Egyptians. The head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, the rear of a hippopotamus. She waits beside the scales. If the heart is judged unworthy, Ammit consumes it. This was not exactly the same concept as the later idea of eternal punishment in a hell. The consequence was more fundamental. The deceased would lose the possibility of achieving the blessed afterlife. The person would fail to become an eternal spirit. Their journey would end. Their identity could be destroyed. For people who believed that existence depended upon preserving the self beyond death, this was terrifying. But there is another fascinating detail. The heart could potentially betray its owner. Some Egyptian spells were intended to prevent the heart from speaking against the deceased. The Egyptians understood that the heart carried memory. The heart knew what the person had done. In the imagination of the ancient Egyptians, you could not simply lie your way into eternity. Your own heart might reveal the truth. Think about what that means. The Egyptians spent their lives preparing for death. They built tombs. They commissioned statues. They created funerary texts. They made offerings. They preserved bodies. But eventually, all of that preparation led to a single moment. Judgment. The heart was placed on the scales, and the universe waited. This idea reveals something profound about ancient Egyptian society. Their fascination with death was also a fascination with morality. The afterlife was not simply about wealth. A king could have gold. A noble could have a magnificent tomb. A wealthy person could afford elaborate funerary equipment. But none of these things could guarantee a good judgment. The heart was the important thing, and this may be one reason Egyptian tombs contain so many moral and religious images. The dead were being reminded of the order they hoped to join. But there was another part of the journey. The dead had to become something new. The goal was not simply to remain a corpse. The goal was transformation. The deceased could become a transformed, effective spirit. This idea of transformation appears throughout Egyptian religion. The dead person could join the gods. They could travel with the sun. They could exist among the blessed dead. They could become part of the cosmic order. In other words, the Egyptian afterlife was not simply a place. It was a process. The dead person had to become capable of existing within a new reality. And that is why funerary rituals were so elaborate. Every stage mattered. The body had to be prepared. The mouth could be ritually opened. Offerings had to be made. Prayers had to be spoken. The correct objects had to be placed in the tomb. The name had to be preserved. The tomb had to remain accessible to the spirit, and the deceased needed protection. This is where amulets became important. Small objects could be placed among the mummy's wrappings. Some represented gods, some carried symbols, some were designed to provide protection. The scarab was especially important. The scarab beetle was associated with regeneration and the rising sun. A heart scarab could be placed with the mummy. Its purpose was connected to the heart and the judgment of the deceased. Again, the dead were being prepared for the journey. Nothing was left to chance. But there was another terrifying possibility. What if the tomb itself was disturbed? What if the mummy was damaged? What if the name was erased? What if the offerings stopped? What if someone stole the protective objects? The Egyptian concept of eternal life depended upon a relationship between the living and the dead. The living were expected to remember their ancestors. They brought offerings. They performed rituals. They spoke names. They maintained tombs. The dead, in return, remained part of the family and the community. This relationship could continue for generations. But eventually, people forgot. Dynasties ended. Cities changed. Religions evolved. Temples collapsed. Tombs were abandoned. Sand covered the entrances, and the names of the dead disappeared. For an Egyptian who believed that remembrance mattered, being forgotten was almost another form of death. This gives us a new way to understand the enormous monuments of Egypt. The pyramids were not only engineering achievements, they were declarations. They said, "Remember me. Remember my name. Remember that I lived. Remember that I ruled. Remember that I belong among the eternal ones." The greatest pharaohs built monuments so enormous that even thousands of years later, we cannot ignore them. Their strategy worked, but not for everyone. Some kings were erased. Some queens vanished. Some tombs were destroyed. Some names were removed. And some bodies disappeared. The Egyptian obsession with eternal memory created an unexpected consequence. It gave later civilizations an enormous amount of evidence. The walls of tombs became records. The coffins became documents. The mummies became biological evidence. The papyri became voices from the past, and the spells became windows into ancient fears. Today, archaeologists can study these materials and reconstruct pieces of a world that vanished long ago. We can examine what people ate, what diseases they suffered, how old they were, how they were buried, what objects surrounded them, what gods they worshipped, and sometimes how they died. The dead have become witnesses. Their bodies can tell stories that their tombs never recorded. Their bones can reveal injuries. Their teeth can reveal diet. Their DNA can reveal relationships. Their mummification can reveal cultural practices. And sometimes, a mummy can completely change our understanding of an ancient event. But there is something haunting about all of this. The Egyptians believed the dead could continue existing. They believed names mattered. They believed memory mattered. They believed the body mattered. And now, thousands of years later, we are doing exactly what they hoped. We are remembering them. We speak their names. We study their faces. We read their inscriptions. We walk through their tombs. We reconstruct their lives. We try to understand their final moments. Perhaps this is the closest thing to the immortality they imagined. Not eternal life in the duat, but survival through memory. Yet the journey of the dead is only one part of the mystery. Because the Egyptians did not simply prepare the dead for the afterlife. They wrote instructions for the journey, and some of those instructions survived. They were hidden inside tombs, written on coffins, painted on walls, copied onto papyrus. They contain strange names, mysterious creatures, dangerous gates, magical formulas, and instructions for confronting the gods. For thousands of years, these words remained silent. Then archaeologists began finding them, and slowly, the ancient Egyptian dead began speaking again. Their message was clear. Death was not a simple ending. It was a journey, and the journey had rules. There were guardians. There were dangers. There was judgment. And beyond all of it, there was the possibility of eternity. But if the ancient Egyptians truly believed the dead could travel through another world, then one question remains. What exactly did they believe was waiting on the other side? Was the duat merely a symbolic representation of death? Or did the Egyptians imagine a literal world inhabited by gods, monsters, and spirits? And why were they so determined to record every detail of that journey? Perhaps the answer lies in the texts themselves. Because when we read the ancient funerary writings, we discover something extraordinary. The Egyptians were not simply describing death. They were trying to defeat it. And the next chapter takes us deeper into that struggle, into the mysterious texts that were created to guide the dead through darkness, through judgment, and toward eternity. The ancient Egyptians called them spells. Today, we call them the Book of the Dead. But perhaps they were something more. A map, a weapon, a survival guide for the journey beyond the grave. Chapter 3. The Secret Books of the Dead. For thousands of years, the tombs of ancient Egypt remained silent. Behind stone walls, beneath layers of sand, the dead waited. Around them were paintings of gods, images of mysterious creatures, scenes of offerings, and words thousands upon thousands of words. Some were prayers, some were hymns, some were instructions, and some were spells. The ancient Egyptians believed that words could do more than communicate. Words could act. A name could contain power. An image could represent a living presence. And a correctly spoken spell could protect the dead from dangers beyond the grave. This belief created one of the most fascinating bodies of religious literature ever produced. Today, we often call one collection the Book of the Dead, but that name can be misleading. There was never one single book called the Book of the Dead. There was no fixed edition, no official volume, no universal Egyptian scripture that every person carried into the afterlife. Instead, there were collections of spells that changed over thousands of years. Some were written inside pyramids, others appeared on coffins. Later versions were written on papyrus and placed inside tombs. The texts evolved, the spells changed, the illustrations became more elaborate, but the purpose remained remarkably consistent. Help the dead survive, help them transform, help them reach the afterlife, and above all, help them avoid destruction. To understand these mysterious texts, we have to go back to the earliest monumental tomb, the pyramids. Long before the famous Book of the Dead appeared, the walls of royal pyramids were covered with sacred inscriptions. These became known as the pyramid texts. They are among the oldest known religious writings from ancient Egypt. The earliest surviving examples were carved inside the pyramid of King Unas, near the end of Egypt's 5th dynasty. The walls were covered with spells. The words were intended to protect the king and help him reach the afterlife. Some spells invoke gods, others describe offerings. Some concern the king's transformation. Others describe his ascent into the heavens. The pyramid itself became part of the religious machinery. Stone, writing, ritual, the king's body, all were connected. The objective was eternity. The king was not supposed to simply die. He was supposed to become something more, a divine being, a celestial presence, a participant in the cosmic order. The pyramid texts were therefore not simply funerary decoration. They were instructions for transformation. But eventually, something changed. The knowledge that had once been primarily associated with kings began to spread. The spells appeared on coffins belonging to non-royal individuals. This new collection became known as the coffin texts. The shift is important. The afterlife was no longer presented only as a royal destination. More people could hope to achieve eternal existence. The magical words were becoming more accessible. The dead could carry their protection with them. And then came the collection modern scholars call the Book of the Dead. Its ancient Egyptian title is often translated as something like Book of Going Forth by Day. That title reveals something fascinating. The goal was not simply to remain in a dark tomb. The deceased wanted to emerge, to travel, to see the light, to exist again. The phrase going forth by day suggests movement from darkness into light, from death toward renewed existence. The tomb was not the destination. It was the beginning. Imagine a wealthy Egyptian preparing for death. The person commissions a funerary papyrus. A scribe carefully writes the spells. Images are added. The deceased appears before gods. The weighing of the heart is depicted. Protective symbols are drawn. The papyrus is rolled. Then it is placed inside the burial. The person may never see the document. It is not meant for the living. It is meant for the dead. A survival manual for eternity. Some spells are short, others are much longer. Some deal with transformation. The deceased may wish to take the form of a bird, a lotus, a falcon, a serpent, or another sacred being. These transformations were not random. The ability to assume different forms could provide freedom and protection in the afterlife. Other spells protect the body. Others help the deceased speak. Others provide access to food and drink. Still others concern the journey through the underworld. The dead needed knowledge, and knowledge itself was power. This is one of the strangest aspects of Egyptian funerary religion. The afterlife could almost resemble a dangerous landscape filled with passwords. There were names to remember, doors to open, guardians to identify, threats to avoid. The deceased had to know the rules, and the texts were there to help. Consider one of the most famous scenes, the Judgment of the Heart. The deceased enters the hall. Anubis stands beside the scales. The heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Thoth records the result. Osiris waits. Amit stands nearby. The scene is terrifying, but the papyrus provides instructions. The deceased must know what to say, what not to say, who to address, how to present themselves. The idea is almost legalistic. The afterlife is a courtroom. The dead person is the defendant. The heart is evidence. The gods are judges, and the final decision determines the person's fate. But what makes this even more fascinating is that the Egyptians believed the heart could potentially testify against its owner. A person's heart carried memory. It knew the truth. So certain spells were designed to prevent the heart from betraying the deceased. A heart scarab could be placed over the heart. The spell associated with it asks the heart not to speak against its owner during judgment. This reveals an extraordinary psychological idea. The Egyptians imagined that the most dangerous witness against you might be yourself, your own heart, your own memories, your own actions. No human courtroom could compare with it, because you could perhaps deceive another person, but you could not deceive your own heart. At least, that was the fear. And yet, the Egyptian texts were not simply about fear. They were also filled with hope. The deceased could reach beautiful fields. One famous destination was the Field of Reeds, a paradise-like realm where the dead could continue a perfected version of life. Fields were fertile. Water was abundant. Food was available. The dead could meet family members. They could work. They could travel. They could exist in peace. The Egyptian afterlife, therefore, contained both terror and beauty. The journey was dangerous, but the destination could be magnificent. This contrast is important. Ancient Egypt did not obsess over death because they wanted to celebrate darkness. They were fascinated by death because they wanted to overcome it. Their religion offered a way through the darkness. The spells were tools. The rituals were preparation. The tomb was protection. The mummy was preservation. The gods were guides. And the deceased was a traveler. But there was another mysterious element. The texts were often personalized. Not everyone received exactly the same spells. A person's wealth mattered. Their social position mattered. Their period in Egyptian history mattered. Their beliefs could influence what was included. A wealthy person might possess a beautifully illustrated papyrus. A poorer person might have only a few spells. Some individuals may have had texts painted directly on coffins. Others may have had simple objects. This means the Book of the Dead was not one uniform religious system. It was a living tradition. It changed as Egyptian society changed. The spells could be copied, modified, rearranged, combined, and sometimes mistakes were made. Scribes copied older texts without always fully understanding them. Words could change. Illustrations could be altered. Different traditions could overlap. This gives modern historians an enormous challenge. When we read these texts today, we are not reading one perfect Egyptian doctrine. We are looking through fragments of a religious tradition that lasted thousands of years, and those fragments sometimes contradict one another. One text might describe one route through the afterlife. Another might describe something completely different. One period might emphasize Osiris. Another might emphasize Ra. Another might combine the traditions. This is why ancient Egyptian religion is so difficult to summarize. It was not static. It evolved, and perhaps that makes it even more fascinating. The Egyptians themselves lived inside a world where religious traditions could overlap. Old gods were not necessarily replaced. They could be combined. A god could absorb characteristics of another. A deity could become connected with a different god. The afterlife could be described in different ways. The Egyptians did not necessarily see these contradictions as problems. Their religious world was flexible, but beneath the complexity was a constant concern. Order versus chaos. Life versus death. Preservation versus destruction. And this brings us back to the terrifying serpent, Apophis, the enemy of Ra. Every night, the sun god travels through darkness. Apophis attempts to stop him. If Apophis succeeds, the sun cannot rise. The world would fall into chaos. But Ra survives. The sun rises. Order is restored. This myth mirrors the journey of the dead. The deceased also enters darkness. The deceased must overcome danger. The deceased seeks transformation. And if successful, the deceased emerges into renewed existence. The same story is repeated at different levels. The sun dies every night. The human being dies once. But both seek rebirth. This connection between the sun and the dead was one of the deepest ideas in Egyptian religion. The rising sun became a symbol of resurrection. Every morning was evidence that darkness could be defeated. For the Egyptians, this was not merely poetry. It was reality. The universe itself demonstrated the possibility of renewal. And this belief influenced Egyptian architecture. Look at the tombs. Many were designed with symbolic movement, from outside to inside, from light to darkness, from the world of the living to the world of the dead. Then, symbolically, from darkness toward rebirth. The tomb became a miniature version of the cosmic journey. But there was one major problem. The dead could not control what happened to their tomb after burial. The tomb might be robbed. The papyrus might be destroyed. The mummy might be damaged. The name might be erased, the offerings might stop, and the spells might disappear. For this reason, the Egyptians developed multiple layers of protection: amulets, statues, paintings, inscribed coffins, funerary masks, protective guards, and written spells. The dead were surrounded by defenses, but the ultimate defense was memory. The living had to continue remembering the dead. A tomb could contain an image of a person receiving offerings. If someone looked at the image and performed the ritual, the offering could symbolically continue. The relationship between the living and the dead was therefore essential. The dead were not completely separate. They remained connected to their descendants. This also explains why ancient Egyptians sometimes left letters to the dead. People could address deceased relatives. They might ask for help. They might complain. They might request intervention. The dead could still matter. They were part of the family. They could still have influence. And that creates one of the strangest aspects of Egyptian culture. The boundary between the living and the dead was not absolute. The dead could remain present in names, in statues, in dreams, in rituals, in memories. And in the darkness of the tomb, thousands of years later, archaeologists began opening those tombs. They discovered papyri. They discovered coffins. They discovered mummies. They discovered spells. But sometimes they discovered something unexpected, a text that had been hidden for thousands of years, a name that had disappeared from history, a story that contradicted the traditional record, a body that revealed evidence of disease or violence, a burial that did not fit expectations. And slowly, the ancient dead began giving up their secrets. One papyrus could reveal a person's beliefs. One coffin could reveal their social status. One spell could reveal what they feared. One mummy could reveal how they died. The written words and the physical body could sometimes tell completely different stories. And when those stories disagreed, the mystery deepened. This is why Egypt remains so compelling. We are not simply reading mythology. We are reconstructing human lives. The spells were written by real people. The tombs were built by real workers. The bodies belonged to real human beings. The fears were real. The hopes were real. The desire for eternity was real. And behind every beautifully illustrated funerary papyrus was once a person who believed that these words could help them survive. Think about that. Someone sat with a scribe thousands of years ago. Perhaps they were old. Perhaps they were sick. Perhaps they simply knew that death was approaching. They paid for a papyrus. They selected spells. They had their name written. They prepared their tomb. They prepared their body. And they hoped that when the final moment came, they would know what to do. They hoped the gods would recognize them. They hoped their heart would pass judgment. They hoped they would find the correct path. They hoped they would emerge from darkness. They hoped they would live forever. And then they died. The tomb was sealed. The papyrus disappeared into darkness. The family continued living. Generations passed. Kings rose. Kings died. Empires changed. Languages evolved. Religions transformed. Eventually, the person was forgotten. But the papyrus remained, waiting. Thousands of years later, someone would open the tomb. Someone would unroll the fragile material. someone would see the strange drawings. Someone would translate the ancient words, and suddenly a voice from the distant past would speak again. The dead were telling us what they feared, what they believed, and what they hoped to find beyond death. But the deeper we explore these texts, the more unsettling the story becomes, because some Egyptians were not simply preparing for a peaceful afterlife. They were trying to survive a terrifying journey. They believed there were creatures waiting in the darkness. They believed there were gates that had to be passed. They believed their hearts could condemn them. And they believed powerful beings controlled the fate of the dead. But there was another mystery. What happened when a pharaoh himself rejected the old gods? What happened when a king decided that Egypt's ancient religious system was wrong? What happened when one ruler attempted to change the relationship between humanity, the gods, and the sun? That story would shake Egypt. Temples would be abandoned. Images of gods would be destroyed. Names would be erased. And after the king's death, Egypt would try to erase him. His name was Akhenaten, and his story begins with one of the strangest religious revolutions in ancient history. A revolution that would transform Egypt, and then almost disappear, until archaeologists found the ruins of his forgotten city beneath the desert. The next mystery awaits there. A city built for a new god, a king who challenged the old gods, a queen whose disappearance remains unexplained, and a dynasty that would eventually attempt to bury the entire experiment. The darkness is getting deeper, and the name of the pharaoh who wanted to change Egypt was Akhenaten. Chapter 4. The pharaoh who disappeared. The desert of Egypt keeps many secrets, but some secrets were not hidden by accident. Some were deliberately buried. Names were carved away. Faces were smashed. Statues were broken. Temples were dismantled. And entire chapters of history were pushed into silence. Among the most mysterious figures to suffer this fate was a pharaoh who attempted something almost unimaginable. He challenged the religious traditions of ancient Egypt. He abandoned the old gods. He built a new capital. He promoted a single divine power above the traditional pantheon. And after his death, Egypt tried to erase him. His name was Akhenaten. But before he became the controversial king remembered by history, he was born into one of Egypt's most powerful royal families. His original name was Amenhotep. He belonged to the 18th dynasty, one of the most prosperous periods in Egyptian history. Egypt was powerful. Its temples were wealthy. Its armies were successful. Its rulers controlled territory far beyond the Nile Valley. And at the center of this world stood the traditional gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and countless other deities. For generations, Egyptian kings had ruled with the support of these religious traditions. The pharaoh was not simply a political leader. He was part of the relationship between humanity and the divine. The temples were centers of religious life. Priests performed rituals. Offerings were made. Sacred images were cared for. The gods were believed to maintain order. And among the most powerful religious institutions was the cult of Amun. The god Amun had become extraordinarily influential. His great temple complex at Karnak possessed enormous wealth and political power. Priests controlled land, workers, offerings, resources. The temple system was deeply embedded in Egyptian society. Then something changed. Amenhotep became king. At first, the transformation was gradual. The young pharaoh continued many traditional practices, but increasingly, one divine symbol began appearing with extraordinary prominence: the Aten. The Aten was represented as the sun disk, its rays extended downward. At the end of each ray was a tiny hand. The image was unlike traditional Egyptian depictions of the gods. Instead of a human body with an animal head, the Aten appeared as the visible disk of the sun. Its rays reached toward the king and royal family. Life was represented as something flowing directly from the sun. This religious idea became increasingly central to the king. Eventually, Amenhotep changed his name. He became Akhenaten. The name was connected to the Aten, and the change was not merely personal. It represented a revolution. Akhenaten began reducing the importance of traditional gods. The names of other deities were attacked. Images were destroyed. The name of Amun was particularly targeted. This was extraordinary. Egyptian religion had always been capable of change. New gods rose. Old gods were combined. Religious traditions evolved. But Akhenaten's reforms went much further. He attempted to transform the religious landscape itself, and this was where politics and religion collided. The temples of the old gods were powerful. Their priests possessed enormous influence. Akhenaten's religious transformation threatened that system. The king began building monuments dedicated to the Aten. He established a new royal city, a place that would become known as Akhenaten. Today, we call the site Amarna. It was built on previously undeveloped land. The location was carefully chosen. The city was meant to be a new beginning, a new religious center, a new capital, a new world. Imagine approaching Akhenaten during its height. The city spreads across the desert. Palaces rise beside broad avenues. Temples dedicated to the Aten dominate the landscape. Royal buildings are decorated with unusual scenes. The royal family appears repeatedly. Akhenaten stands beside his great royal wife, Nefertiti, and here the story becomes even more mysterious. Because Nefertiti was not simply a queen standing quietly behind her husband, she appears prominently in the art of the Amarna period. She participates in religious scenes. She appears beside Akhenaten. Sometimes she is shown in ways that seem almost equal in scale and importance. The royal family becomes the center of the religious system. The Aten's rays descend upon them. Life is given directly to the king and queen. The imagery is intimate, sometimes surprisingly naturalistic. The royal family is shown with children. They embrace, they interact, they appear human. This artistic style was very different from the idealized images that dominated earlier Egyptian art. Bodies could appear elongated, features could appear exaggerated. The royal family could be shown in unusual poses. Scholars continue to debate exactly how much of this reflected reality and how much was artistic convention. But one thing is certain. Amarna represented a dramatic change. The king had created an entirely new religious and artistic world, and for a time it worked. But there was a price. The old temples suffered. Traditional religious institutions were disrupted. Akhenaten's reforms created enemies, and the king's new capital depended heavily on his personal authority. The Aten religion was centered around the royal family. The king was the intermediary. The queen played an extraordinary role. Without them, the system was vulnerable. Then came another mystery. Nefertiti disappeared from the historical record. At first, she appears everywhere. Then, she becomes less visible. Her later history is uncertain. There are theories. Some scholars have suggested she may have died. Others have proposed that she may have taken another name. Some have suggested she could have ruled in some capacity after Akhenaten. But the evidence is incomplete, and this uncertainty has created one of Egypt's most enduring mysteries. What happened to Nefertiti? Her disappearance becomes even more significant because Akhenaten's reign was also beginning to unravel. The international situation was changing. Egyptian control over territories in the Near East faced challenges. Letters from the Amarna archive reveal requests for military assistance from foreign rulers. Some complained that Egyptian power was weakening. Whether Akhenaten's religious revolution directly caused these problems remains debated. But the kingdom was under pressure. Inside Egypt, the old religious system had not disappeared. People continued to worship traditional gods. The king could close temples. He could erase names. He could redirect resources. But changing the beliefs of an entire civilization was much more difficult. The Aten religion depended heavily on royal power, and royal power eventually ends. Akhenaten died, and when he did, the revolution began collapsing. The city he had built was abandoned. The religious reforms were reversed. The old gods returned. Amun returned. The traditional temples were restored. The names associated with the Amarna experiment were attacked. The memory of Akhenaten became dangerous. His monuments were dismantled. His images were destroyed. His name was excluded from later royal records. His city was abandoned to the desert. It was almost as if Egypt wanted to pretend he had never existed. And for centuries, the strategy worked. Akhenaten became a missing chapter. Then archaeology began to recover him. In the 19th century, European explorers and archaeologists encountered the ruins of Amarna. The desert began giving up its secrets, fragments of statues, reliefs, buildings, letters, images of the royal family. And suddenly, the forgotten king returned. The evidence revealed something astonishing. The ancient Egyptians had not simply forgotten Akhenaten, they had tried to erase him. There is a difference. Forgetting happens naturally. Erasure requires effort. Someone had to order the names removed. Someone had to destroy monuments. Someone had to dismantle buildings. Someone had to suppress the memory. Why? Perhaps because Akhenaten had threatened the foundations of the traditional religious system. Perhaps because his successors wanted to restore stability. Perhaps because his religion had become associated with failure. Perhaps because, later, rulers wanted to distance themselves from his controversial reign. The truth may include several factors, but the result was clear. Akhenaten's experiment was buried. And then another question emerged. Where was his body? The pharaoh who built a city for himself did not have an obvious surviving tomb. His burial history is uncertain. A royal tomb was constructed at Amarna, but the fate of Akhenaten's body remains complicated. At some point, his remains appear to have been moved. But certainty is difficult. This uncertainty feeds the larger mystery. If Akhenaten's body was relocated, where did it go? And what happened to Nefertiti? Did she die before him? Did she survive? Could she have ruled under another name? Could she have been buried elsewhere? For decades, researchers have searched for answers, and one possible connection became especially intriguing: the tomb of Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter entered Tutankhamun's tomb thousands of years later, he discovered evidence from the Amarna period, objects connected to Akhenaten's world, royal figures, fragments, names, artifacts, and perhaps clues to the chaotic transition that followed Akhenaten's death. Tutankhamun himself was born into this turbulent world. His original name was Tutankhaten, a name connected to the Aten. Later, after the restoration of the old religion, he changed his name to Tutankhamun. The change was symbolic. The Aten was being abandoned. Amun was returning. The young king became part of the restoration. And suddenly, the boy king, whose tomb would become the greatest archaeological sensation in modern history, was connected directly to the religious revolution of Akhenaten. This makes Tutankhamun's story even more important. He was not simply a young pharaoh. He was a product of a crisis, a child born into the aftermath of one of Egypt's most dramatic religious experiments. His reign helped restore the old order. His death would come only a few years later, and his tomb would preserve fragments of a world that his successors wanted to erase. But before we reach the Golden Mask, we must return to Nefertiti, because her mystery has survived for more than 3,000 years. Her face became one of the most recognizable images from ancient Egypt. A limestone bust discovered at Amarna shows a woman with an elegant crown and striking features. The sculpture became famous around the world, but the woman behind the face remains surprisingly elusive. We know that Nefertiti was queen. We know she was central to the Amarna royal family. We know she participated prominently in the Aten religion. We know she had several daughters with Akhenaten, but then she disappears. There is no definitive surviving account of her death, no universally accepted tomb, no confirmed mummy, no simple ending. And this is where history begins to blend with mystery. Over the years, countless theories have emerged. Some suggest she died during the later years of Akhenaten's reign. Some propose she adopted another identity. Some theories connect her with a mysterious ruler whose identity remains debated. Others suggest she may have been buried somewhere near the Amarna royal tomb. But none of these possibilities has been conclusively proven. The mystery remains. And perhaps the most fascinating possibility is not that Nefertiti was deliberately hidden, but that her tomb simply remains undiscovered. If so, somewhere beneath the Egyptian landscape may be the burial place of one of the most famous women of the ancient world, a tomb containing objects untouched for thousands of years, a tomb that could potentially reveal the final chapter of the Amarna period. But until such evidence is found, we must remain careful. History does not allow us to turn possibility into fact. That is the challenge of ancient Egypt. The gaps in the evidence are enormous, and where evidence disappears, stories rush in to fill the darkness. Akhenaten's story is a perfect example. For centuries, he was almost invisible, Then archaeology brought him back. His city emerged from the desert. His images returned. His letters were discovered. His family became visible again. And suddenly, the pharaoh who had been erased was speaking. But his story raises an uncomfortable question. If the Egyptians were willing to erase a king, what else did they erase? How many rulers vanished from history? How many royal women disappeared? How many bodies were moved? How many tombs were destroyed? How many names were deliberately removed? And how many secrets remain hidden beneath the desert? The story of Akhenaten is not simply the story of a strange pharaoh. It is a warning. History is not always what survives. Sometimes history is what someone wanted future generations to remember. And sometimes history is what someone desperately wanted them to forget. Akhenaten wanted to create a new Egypt. His successors wanted the old Egypt back. The temples of the old gods returned. His city emptied. His monuments were dismantled. His name disappeared. And the desert swallowed the remains. But the desert has a habit of preserving what humans try to destroy. Thousands of years later, archaeologists found his city. They found his family. They found his art. They found his letters. And they found clues to a mystery that is still unresolved. What happened to the people at the center of the Amarna revolution? What happened to Nefertiti? What happened to Akhenaten's body? And what happened to the royal family after the religious revolution collapsed? The answers lead us toward one of the most famous names in ancient history. A boy, a golden mask, a hidden tomb, and a death that came far too early. Tutankhamun. But before the world would discover his treasures, there was another story unfolding in the shadows. A story about a queen who vanished, a royal family torn apart by a religious revolution, and a tomb whose location may still be waiting beneath Egypt. The pharaoh had tried to change the gods. His successors tried to erase him, but they could not erase everything, because deep beneath the desert, the evidence survived, and eventually someone would find it. End note. Ancient Egypt leaves us with a strange feeling. The more we discover, the more we realize how much remains unknown. We have uncovered temples, pyramids, tombs, statues, papyri, and mummies. We have learned the names of kings who lived thousands of years ago. We have reconstructed their rituals, studied their bodies, translated their writings, and followed the traces they left behind. And yet, the desert remains silent. Akhenaten reminds us that history can be erased. A king can attempt to change an entire civilization, only for his successors to destroy his monuments and remove his name. Nefertiti reminds us that even the most powerful people can disappear into uncertainty. Tutankhamun reminds us that sometimes the greatest discoveries come from places that were forgotten. And the ancient funerary texts remind us why these people built their civilization around remembrance. They feared being forgotten. They believed that a person's name, body, image, and memory were connected to existence itself. Perhaps that is why their monuments still affect us today. The pyramids are not simply stones. The tombs are not simply chambers. The mummies are not simply archaeological specimens. They are fragments of human lives. People who loved, people who feared death, people who dreamed of eternity, people who believed that somewhere beyond the darkness, another existence was waiting. Their world is gone. Their temples have fallen. Their kingdoms have disappeared, but their voices remain. They speak through inscriptions carved into stone, through fragile papyri, through paintings hidden inside tombs, through the faces preserved beneath layers of linen. And sometimes they speak through mysteries that we still cannot solve. Who was truly buried in a forgotten tomb? Where did Nefertiti's story end? How many royal burials remain undiscovered? How many ancient crimes are still hidden beneath the sand? We may never know every answer, and perhaps that is what makes ancient Egypt so powerful. It does not give us a complete story. It gives us fragments, clues, silences, questions. The darkness between those fragments is where the mystery lives. Tonight, we entered that darkness. We followed the ancient Egyptians through their beliefs about death, through the dangerous journey of the Duat, through the secret spells of the dead, and into the extraordinary reign of a pharaoh who attempted to change Egypt forever. But this is only one part of the story. There are still kings whose tombs have never been found. There are still mummies whose identities remain uncertain. There are still ancient cities buried beneath modern landscapes. And beneath the sands of Egypt, the past continues to wait. Perhaps one day, another tomb will open, another name will appear, another forgotten story will return. Until then, the desert keeps its secrets. And somewhere beneath the ancient stones, the dead are still waiting to be remembered. This is Zixity Night History, where history doesn't end in the past. It waits for us in the darkness.